So welcome to this video. This will be me covering what I think the hardest factions for each race are. The focus will be on diplomacy, how they start, who they're at war with, that kind of stuff. I'll also take into account Lord Strength, so the legendary Lord Strength at the start, and then just the comparative strength of the faction in question with surrounding factions. So without further ado, I'm going to be going down the column as I do with these videos. There's no particular side of that. So starting with the Beastmen, the hardest faction for me would be Kazarak. He starts in the middle of the Empire. You do have a northern and eastern border with some friendly factions. They're not that friendly, but they shouldn't declare war on you. But you are in the heartland of the Empire outside of that, and you are starting at war with the Laurelian Forest, with Middenland, with Reichland, and that's quite a lot of enemies, I think, for a new player. Also, the initial battle with the Wood Elves is quite difficult. You have an outside army you have to deal with, which isn't too bad, but if you auto-resolve, you're losing a lot more than you need to. And then you've also got a garrison within the forest settlement. And on top of that, they've also got a small army in there as well. So that first battle is quite difficult. And I imagine that a lot of new players have probably lost on the first turn because of that. So for those reasons, I think you shouldn't choose Kazarak. I don't think the Empire is that strong in the early game, but you do have to deal with a lot, and the Wood Elves specifically are just going to be quite a hurdle to get over. So definitely the other choices that I've mentioned in previous videos would be better. Okay, moving on to the Demons of Chaos. Both the easiest and the hardest faction, the only faction. Overall, I would say this is quite a difficult campaign, and I wouldn't recommend this. It should be one of the later campaigns you do. It is quite difficult, but it is an interesting and unique way of playing. And then we go into the Empire. Obvious choice for me here. That would be Marcus Wolfheart. He is an okay lord, but he doesn't have a mount, so he's quite susceptible to getting picked off. What he buffs well, but archers and huntsmen aren't very good in Lustria. They're okay archers, but they don't have a huge amount of armor piercing. And you've got a lot of enemies in the Lizardman, in Khorne, who have, and even in the Dark Elves that have quite a lot of armor. And the mechanic where he gets units from the Empire and he can't really recruit his own units that well, it's just not very good, and it's just a very hard fight. It's basically you, Bordelot, and Cathay against the rest, because the Lizardmen hate you. If you weren't playing as him, you might be able to get agreements with them to some extent. Fight off Scavens, fight off Rakaf, but they just hate him as much as they hate anyone, even more than they hate anyone else. So you're in for a rough ride. You don't have great tools to deal with it. But definitely the hardest. Honorable mention would be Carl, especially on higher difficulties. You just got a lot of enemies, but I think Marcus still is he's just a bit more problematic. He doesn't have as good settlements, economy, and just doesn't have the answers. But not unwinnable, but just very difficult. So it should be a lost campaign. You've got a lot of better options here. High Elves. So there are two picks for me for the High Elves. Both are quite difficult. I wouldn't say, some people may have more difficulty, some people may have less difficulty, depending on your playstyle, that kind of thing. But for me, Imric's the honorable mention. He is quite a difficult campaign. You start in a not the best area. You've got Clan Moors to your west, you have Clan Rictus to your north, you have Chaos Dwarfs to your east. You've also got Nurgle down here. You've got Grimwall coming down if you're unlucky. So it can turn into quite a difficult campaign. Now, Imric himself is extremely strong as a lord, especially when he gets on his dragon. He buffs his army quite nicely. The dragon mechanic, very, very powerful. Lots of nice faction-wide buffs. So, no problems with that, but you are versing Chaos Dwarves who like to produce a lot of goblin laborers. You're versing Clan Rictus, and Scaven love to produce lots of crappy armies. and that can lead to situations where you're getting skirmished, you're getting small settlements picked off when your army's not there. The High Elves don't have the best early game. If you're in Ulthuan, that's fine, but if you're outside of Ulthuan, they've got very expensive units. It takes their economy a while to get up. Their economy is good, but you just don't have that kind of breathing space in the early game. And so you do need to be very quick on dealing with these threats, otherwise they will overwhelm you. But that is only the honorable mention. For me, the hardest faction in the game would be Teclis. Not in the game. For the High Elves is Teclis. You have to deal with Kyros very early on. That's very annoying. Kyros, in my opinion, is probably one of the strongest AI factions you have to deal with. They just get so many buffs early on, and it's just so annoying. And that's with them not even using the faction that well. But now you also have, from a recent patch, you have Wurzag to your north. So you've just got even more problems. If Wurzag doesn't do very well and the Lizardmen survive, you've got the Lizardmen who you do get bonuses with them. But if you start attacking one of them, the other one's going to hate you, and then you're probably just going to end up at war with them. You don't have great climate. You're not in the area either. So your unpleasant is mountainous. So this whole strip in the middle, you don't really like. And Barrens isn't good, desert isn't good. So heading north, you just don't have many climates that like you. Heading to the Chaos Waste is the exact same thing. And then you've got to deal with all of these sort of either enemies or factions that just are pretty apathetic to you or just don't like you that much, even with these benefits here. And so the best way previously was just to go back to Ulthuan, but Kalador gets wiped out very early on. Not Kalador, that's Imrik. So sorry, Imrik, Kalador gets wiped out, so he doesn't have that avenue anymore. Teclis doesn't even have that option. So you could migrate back, but that takes like a bunch of turns, and you're still competing with Tyrion, who never confederates, Alariel, who probably won't if you're weak, and Lotharion's almost as bad as Tyrion. So it's just a tough campaign. Putting aside the fact that Kyros is hard to beat, Wurzag may be hard to beat, you're just kind of stuck here. So from start to finish, it's an awkward campaign, and it is what I think the hardest is for the High Elves. All right, moving on to the Lizardman. My top pick for the hardest faction would be Mazdamundi. You start off with a non-aggression pact with Morathi, and I think that's by design because the developers did not want you to be dealing with her straight away. But she will break that and eventually come down south and attack you, and she's a very strong faction. Also, her lands aren't very good for you, so it's a big negative having to fight her. Initially, you have to deal with a minor Slaneshi faction, which is, it's not a weak faction, and it does quite well against the skin cohorts. You also have to deal with Skeggi, who's very strong, and for a minor faction as well, and you've got both of them, so you do need to be quite quick there. But then also you've got the Empire factions, the New World colonies, that dislike Lizardmen greatly, so you're going to have to deal with them. And then by the time you get down to Lustria, you've got Skulltaker, you've got the Harkon. It does depend who wins and how that happens, but yeah, there's always a threat here when you head south, and especially the quicker you are. You also got Rakath, so it's a very hard campaign. You also don't have great faction effects or lot effects. Mazdamundi is very weak until he gets on his mount, so that just exacerbates that problem. Temple Guard is a later game unit. It's not the best unit, it just doesn't have high attack. You can make an army of it, but I've just had a lot more success with Chameleon Skinks. And yeah, just kind of an underwhelming. He's got -10 with most factions. I think he's always a pain when you play with him. Honorable mentions. I mean, Krokgar can be really annoying. Maybe Tic Tac Toe. The others are okay, but Lizardmen always have some threats in the area. But yeah, my pick, Mazdamundi, as the hardest. Avoid him. Go with maybe Krokgar or Nakai if you want to play something different. All right, Ogre Kingdoms. So for me, it's Scrag. Starts off in an awkward spot. The empire you naturally have from your initial faction is very long and thin. You've got the Vampire Coast who really don't like you and probably will declare war on you. You've got Belagar north of you, stretching quite far along your territory, so he can underway over, and there's a lot of it's very hard to deal with, especially as you scale up the difficulty. As a faction, really strong, but you've got a lot of enemies. You've got greenskins, you've got dwarfs if they win, which is going to be a pain. You've got the Empire north of you, you've got wood elves. So any direction you go, you're going to have enemies, and you always have to watch your vanguard. Otherwise, where you could just get attacked. So quite a difficult campaign. But Greases isn't easy either, but definitely for me, Scrag's the harder of the two. Tomb Kings. Me, definitely Khalida. She starts with Krokkar to her south. She starts with Thoric to her west, both who will probably declare war on you unless you perform some diplomatic stuff. Just be warned about that. You really do need to. But in terms of your units and what you can make, really hard to deal with the source spam of Krokkar. Really hard to just deal with the quality of the dwarven units if you fight Thoric. And then let's say you get out of that, you've got Scarbrand, you've got Kyros who might come up, you've got Wurzag, so you just have a lot of enemies constantly fighting. She's not the strongest lord either. The buffs, her faction and lord effects are solid though, but as a fighter herself, she's a bit underwhelming, unfortunately, because she is quite a unique lord. So yeah, not much else to say about that, but and you don't have a huge amount of allies. You have to really understand the game, and I think just being really cautious about who you make friends with, and that takes some experience. So I definitely consider playing the other ones, especially the ones in Araby, before you play later. All right, now we go to vampire counts. I think that vampire counts, there isn't a huge amount of difference between the difficulty. You're just vampire counts, so you're going to be fighting a lot. You don't have a huge amount of allies, but I'm going to have to go with Heinrich Kemmler. From the get-go, you have to deal with Lewin, who's quite difficult. You've got Grom, who could become a threat. You've got Icodclaw. Wood Elves don't like you. In my last campaign, Reichland declared war on me very early on. So you've just got a lot of threats and just a lot of continuous threats. You do get a nice diplomatic relations with the Warriors of Chaos and all of those Chaos-aligned factions, but the higher the difficulty you go, the less that means, and it kind of just breaks even if you're playing on the highest difficulties. So, but for a new player, that should help a lot. But you just have a lot of enemies here, and if Carcassonne beats Grom, if the Scaven gets suppressed, then you're versing an Autotide if you take too long, and it's just going to be very difficult. But as I said again, a lot of the vampire counts have these difficulties as well. It's just, I think Heinrich Kemmler's a bit more difficult. So definitely choose either Manfred or Isabella as your first two, or Heinrich. Just a bit more difficult. Oh, or Hellman. I don't know. It's difficult, but I think Heinrich's definitely the hardest. Okay, moving on to the Bretonians. So for me, it's the Fey Enchantress. You have to deal with the Grom early game. You have to deal with Icodclaw early game, and these can be quite overwhelming. I think that if you get past this, which is quite hard, it becomes the easiest campaign because Lewin often survives, and you can kind of really protect Bretonia together. The Wood Elves tend to like you, so you've kind of got that buffer to the east as well. It's just that initial Grom's very powerful, and I think being able to take him out early before he was is very good. So definitely, if I'm playing Lewin and Carcassonne gets wiped out, I've got a much harder campaign in the long term, but in the short term, she just has a lot to deal with. Not a very strong fighter. Buffs she gives aren't very good. I'd much prefer Lewin in her situation, but yeah, she's just a very underwhelming legendary lord. And she's just in a very tough starting position. But if you can overcome that, she becomes one of the easier characters. Also, honorable mention to Alberic. He's just got a lot of enemy. Lustria is Lustria. You know, there's just a lot of strong enemies there, and and it's just hard for a Bretonia to deal with in the early game. But I still think the Fey Enchantress is it's just that much harder. All right, moving on to the Dark Elves. So I've got two picks here, but one specifically I'm going to go Crone. She is my pick for the hardest. The Legendary Lords. You have to deal with Valkyr. You have to deal with Sigvald. Both have vassals, so you just got a lot of armies. This area of the map is quite large, and you do find yourself getting a bit overwhelmed. You can make one and a half armies early on, and it's just very difficult to deal with all those extra armies that they have. And so you've got to be quite aggressive, and I think that'd just be quite hard for a new player. But at the same time, kind of like the Fey Enchantress, if you get past those early stages, you're sandwiched between Malekith, who can dislike you, so you do have to manage that. Malice to the east, so if they both survive, you kind of just sandwich between two friendly forces, and so it becomes a lot easier once you get out of that initial. But you know, fighting Valkyr and Sigvald with their vassals is quite difficult. As a lord, she does provide witch elves, which are very, very strong. The buff she gives them, I mean, they can really wipe through the chaos forces with their potential. But you know, you've got a lot of armies you need to deal with, and public order can be a problem for the dark elves. Her mechanics very strong, but it's also a bit awkward, and it's something that I wouldn't recommend a new player doing until they played, you know, one of the more standard dark elven factions. Honorable mention goes to Malice. Kind of different situation. His mechanic allows him to get good relations with chaos aligned factions. At the same time, though, if you ignore it or mismanage it, you can find yourself at war with heaps of chaos factions, which you probably won't be able to deal with fully. But he's very strong. Mechanics are strong if you work with them well, but what he buffs is a bit late game, and it's quite an underwhelming unit compared to others. You think it would do better than it does, but also, but at the same time, if you do use the mechanic well, and you do manage to head west and take out a lot of the enemies there, then you know you've got Malekith, you've got you can maybe confederate Helebron, or you've got her as an ally, and so it can become a lot easier like her. But I think those two can be quite hard. All right, moving on to the Grand Cathay. So for me, Miao Ying is the hardest, but I think that Xiao Ming and Miao Ying are both of a comparable difficulty. But I just choose her. You do have to deal with Village early on. You have to deal with Eshin. You have to deal with the Dread Fleet, and they can be quite problematic. And you also have to sort of get on top of the gates before, as early as possible. So I think they are in the early game, especially the first 20-30 turns, she's just quite a bit harder than Zhao Ming. Same thing with the Fey Enchantress, though. Once you get out of that sort of initial difficulty, she can be quite easy, because she just gets so many more territories early on, and she just gets the bonuses of those gates to protect from the Northern Chaos Waves. Whereas if you're playing him, she can die, and then you've got to deal with all this stuff coming from. But his initial start better, and that's what that's what I think is more for a new player, just getting out of that first 10-20 turns so you can actually experience it. So for me, Miao Ying's definitely the hardest of the choice. Hardest of these three choices. All right, Khorne. Scarbrand's the hardest. These two are very powerful. I did go through it in a previous video, but Scarbrand's just got a lot of stuff going on. You know, you've got to deal with Thoric, you've got Khemri, you've got the Dwarven threat from the north. You can make agreements with Moors and the Beastmen, which is good, but you always have this northern threat of the Order Tide, especially the Empire. But from the south, where you most likely will head, maybe you've got to deal with Rapants, maybe Khemri. You've got to deal with Thoric. Wurzag's probably not going to like you very much. Well, especially on higher difficulties. And it's hard to get used to the mechanics of Khorne. They play very differently to most factions. They're far more raising all the settlements and then using that colonizing effect, and I think it can be hard to manage. And then they've got the blood hosts, which are sort of a whole different thing to learn. But yeah, definitely Scarbrand is the hardest. You can pick him early on. He is quite fun, but these guys are definitely easy. All right, moving on to Norska. My pick is Throg. Starts in a really awkward area. Kind of, sort of, a bit removed from the rest of the Norskans. So confederations can be a bit awkward. You do have Malachi that you need to deal with. You're closer to Kislev as well. So you've just got a lot more enemies in that regard. His ability to buff his Norse controls or Norscan ice trolls is exceptional, and you can make a really strong army with just them. But at the same time, they're not quite as good in other armies as they are in his. Also, I think Wolfric's ability to reduce the upkeep from Marauder units is just a bit more powerful for the early game, and his starting position is a bit better. But Throg's okay. He's just not as easy as Wolfric. So now we go to Scaven. So Scaven are quite a strong faction, but my pick would definitely be Tretch. All right, yeah, Tretch Craventail. It starts off near Imric. This is kind of a bit of a melting pot of difficulty. You've got Imric. You've got the Chaos Dwarves all around you. You've got the Dwarves who are always going to be a threat. So you've just got a lot of enemies. Saving grace is that you do have clan wars right near you. So you can confederate or form a sort of dual alliance with them. But you just have a lot of enemies. He's quite a weak lord. His lord effect's quite nice, but him as a fighter is terrible or very bad. His buffs for the faction aren't great, so it's nicer to confederate him. He buffs Storm Vermin, but compared to Moors, it's just like a cheap version of that. So he's got a difficult start. He doesn't really buff things as well as he should. And the movement, if you retreat from someone, you get these bonuses. But that's not always the best decision to make. Sometimes you need all the movement you get in order to kill an army, get a settlement, kind of stuff. But I think whilst he's bad, he's not as bad as some of the other options that I've mentioned. It's just Skaven's quite strong, but he is a very weak lord. It's undeniable. So now let's go into Tzeentch. Definitely Kyros is the harder of the two. I don't have the changeling though, so Kyros is kind of my whole thing. He's the best and the worst. But of these two, he's definitely the hardest. I played the campaign recently with the introduction of Wurzag to the north of Teclis. It does distract Teclis and allow you just to focus on Oxyotl. So that's good. But Oxyotl is quite a strong initial faction to deal with. You do have to be very careful. And the longer it goes on, the stronger the armies get, and it gets very difficult for Tzeentch to deal with that, especially if you're playing on higher difficulties with far more bonuses. Okay, but that's all I want to say about that. A hard campaign, but definitely not as hard as it used to be. Far more manageable. You may have to deal with Teclis, but he will often get distracted by Wurzag, and you do have the changing of the ways. Kyros is one of probably the strongest spellcaster in the game. His faction mechanics are just really, really, really overpowered with the changing of the ways. So not too bad, but of these two, definitely the harder one. Warriors of Chaos, for me, definitely Sigvold. You have to deal with Crone Hellebron, and if you're on higher difficulties, Norska will also come after you, which is an absolute pain. And then you've got Valkyr, who naturally hates Slaaneshi aligned things, so Valkyr's probably going to may declare war on you as well. I think Warriors of Chaos are quite an easy race to play, but I think there is definitely an early game challenge to Sigvald's campaign that you have to be aware of. Compared to Archaon and Be'lakor, who just don't have that, and it's far more leisurely. Sigvald does have a lot of challenges in his campaign, so definitely Sigvald for me. Honorable mention would be Kolek. He does have to deal with potentially, he does have to eventually deal with Tomrakan, who can get very strong, and you do need to deal with an early game Grimgor, who can be really problematic. But I think that Sigvald's campaign is quite a bit harder. All right, now on to the Chaos Dwarfs. So we're going to start with, so the hardest in my opinion would be the Legion of Asgore. Their starting position, like Trench, like Imrik, is just quite difficult. You have Imrik you have to deal with, you've got Anrictus, you've got Greasus on higher difficulties, who is more than happy to declare war on you. And so it's just a lot of things to deal with. In my opinion, he's probably the strongest on the battle map. Yeah, flying, great magic, but just a really difficult start. You've got a lot of enemies. You've got a lot of enemies in the future as well. You've got Cathay to your east. You have potentially the dwarves to your west. So you're kind of sandwiched in there. It's quite hard to, you really do want to target the dwarves if they're getting strong, and that can be quite hard. And there's always a potential that the other Chaos Dwarfs get wiped out, which can cause its own problems. But I just think he's a bit harder. I think he's strong, I think he's fun, but I think just his position's quite hard. Honorable mention to Zartan. You do have to deal with Grimgor early on, who's very, very strong. You've got to worry about Khorne and Tomrakan. You kind of need to try and get diplomatic relations with them. So it can be a little bit complicated as well, but I just think his starting is a bit more difficult. So I would definitely play Astrogoth first, but I do think he's the hardest. I think either of them can be quite hard, but I do think that the Legion of Asgore are harder. All right, moving on to the dwarfs. So Malachi would be the hardest, but I don't have him. That's just from what I've seen. Oh, actually, no, I don't think Malachi's the hardest. I think just Belegar. Belegar's the hardest. The 50% upkeep until you take Kazarak 8 peaks is incredibly challenging. You've got to go all the way over here. From here, and this area, you've got quite a lot of enemies. You've got the Vampire Coast. You've got Icklor specifically. You've got Scrag. And if you leave this area, you may just get a lot of enemies over here, which can be really annoying. He's reasonably strong. Buffs are reasonably nice. He starts with the ancestral heroes, which are very strong as well, but it's just difficult. And the higher the difficulty you get to, the harder it is. So definitely should be your last Dwarven campaign. Honorable mention to Malachi, as I said, but I can't say too much about him. But just from what I've seen, he is quite hard. He has a lot of enemies. But I think Belegar is just the hardest. All right, now I'm going to go to the Greenskins. So for me, the hardest would be Grom. I think Grom is an exceptionally, as a fighter, he's interesting. I wouldn't say he's strong, but he definitely has his, strengths. As someone who buffs the army, incredibly good for dwarves. Incredibly best one at buffing dwarves. And it shows when you're playing dwarves, especially nasty skulkers, they become extremely powerful. But you need it. You're starting surrounded by Bretonia. You've got Icklor, who once you take sort of Carcassonne in that area, Icklor's got nowhere to go but towards you. So he can go east, but he really likes to go north. You got the Wood Elves who hate you. You've got the High Elves if they manage to consolidate. North One who hate you. You've got Lowen coming from the north. You're right on the Empire. You don't have great Confederation opportunities with the Greenskins since you can't really fight them. Diplomacy can be a pain. So he's just a lot harder than the others. A lot to do with proximity, but also just the quality of the enemies around him. Scaven in early game are quite difficult. Wood Elves are one of the most difficult. And then you've always got the threat of that Empire. So definitely Grom. And we're going to go to Kislev. So for me, it would definitely be Boris, Ursus, even with the changes which have made them, I'd say, stronger. He just has a lot of enemies. You've got Daniel, the Demons of Chaos. You've got Arbel now, who's very painful to deal with. You've got Archaon. You've got Turmerican, and he's probably going to have his mount and just be a real pain. And then if you do manage to overcome that, then you've got a Kislev who are probably very powerful because of all the sacrifice that you made. So it could be quite annoying. As a Lord, really, really, really nice. Great faction effects. Exceptional Lord effects, especially for his starting position. He does have the tools to beat Chaos, but it is very difficult. Archaon is one of the strongest starting factions. Turmerican's very strong. Arbel and Archaon are both some of the strongest starting factions of the game. And then you always have the threat of both the Tallyman and the Demons of Chaos, who I've been attacked by both with. So just a really hard campaign. Definitely the last one you should do is Kislev. All the other ones are, quite a lot easier. Okay, now moving on to Nurgle. The hardest would definitely be Kugath. I think just those two are a lot easier. But Kugath, you start in a really nice province, but you've got to deal with strong vampire counts. You've got Greasus, who's going to be a pain. You do have a nice little buffer with the Chaos Dwarves, but they don't always win, and then your campaign gets a lot harder. You've got to deal with Gelts. You've got to deal with Cathay, and you're kind of on a little bit of a timer. If you're unlucky, Grom will come down. And sorry, not Grom. Okay, I'm gonna have to go back. Okay. Grimgor. The Grimgor will come down from the north. That'll be an absolute pain. So it can be quite hard. He does have the tools, but it definitely is the hardest of these three campaigns. All right, moving on to Slaanesh. So this is just before the new Slaanesh DLC, so we'll have to see then. But Kari is both the easiest and the hardest, like Daniel. And this is, I would say, quite a hard campaign. Nakari and Slaanesh are very strong, but you do have to learn how to play with them, and that takes more than one campaign. So I would not recommend this as a first. He's a very fun Lord to play, very strong Lord on the battle map, very nice Lord effects, faction effects, especially Lord effects, and just a lot of fun, but not one of the first campaigns I'd recommend. Then we go to Vampire Coast. So the hardest for me would be Aranessa. Starts in an awkward spot. You can sort of get diplomatic ties with both Scrag and Icket Claw, which makes the campaign quite a lot easier. But you do have to deal with Belagar. What Aranessa buffs is Sartosan units. You don't get a red line with them. You don't get any technology bonuses from them. So they're just very underwhelming, and you're versing your potential enemies are Scrag, who isn't infantry. They're all monstrous infantry for the most part. But I like to get an agreement with him if I can. And then you've got the Dwarfs, who have very high quality early game units. They're very difficult to deal with. These guys don't have armor piercing, so they trade, even with buffs, they trade quite equally with the Dwarf and sort of mid-tier units. But once you start getting to Hammerers and Oathbreakers, you just can't compete with them that well, which you probably won't. You'll probably die before then, but Belagar's quite the threat, and then after that, it's like you can go into the Empire, but you've got the Wood Elves, you've got the Empire who don't like you. Your relationship with Icket might not be the best in the long run. Generally, I like to head south, but Rapunzel can dominate that area very quickly, and she's not easy to deal with for undead. So it's just quite a hard campaign. The bonus gold you get from discovering the events on the water is really, really nice, but It's just a lot of enemies. The Vampire Coast aren't the best early game faction. They really want to be building up their legendary captains, which takes quite a lot of infamy and time. And they just have a lot of strong enemies. She has quite a lot of strong enemies in the area. She, as a fighter, isn't very good. She's not an undead. You can't leverage vampire magic to heal her. And as a fighter, she's just pretty ordinary. So definitely Aranessa out of these three by a long shot to me. But anyway, and then we get to the last race, which is the Wood Elves. Wood Elves are a very strong faction, but for me, definitely the hardest would be Draika. She starts near Kislev, near the von Carsteins, and they're just really, they're quite strong opponents. You probably definitely will go to war with the vampire counts. They're quite a difficult opponent. I mean, she has the tools. Her ability to buff the trees is very nice, and she can make really strong armies with. And she has a lot of enemies. She doesn't start with the Oak of Ages. She has to fight Talson for them. She can only confederate Durthu. So she's just got a much harder campaign because you do have to fight them. That's probably the best option, just to fight them and take back all this land so you can start really building up armies. But she has to deal with the vampire counts, maybe Kislev first. Really do need to be careful about your diplomacy with the Empire and all the factions around you. And then you're fighting the Wood Elves, and it can be quite tough. I think all the other ones are definitely easier than Draika. She's drawn the short twig, as you may say. But I think that's just a nice little summary. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it helped. Let me know if you want to see anything else, or there's something you think's a real egregious error on my part. But I hope this helps you in your future campaigns. See you in the next video.